When Samuel Johnson woke up that morning, he expected it to be just another day on his farm, tending to his crops and living the simple life he had always known. But little did he know, this day would push him to the edge and reveal not just the strength of his spirit but the power of family. As Samuel went about his day, he noticed something unsettling. A pair of local officers watching his every move, their intentions anything but friendly. What started as routine harassment quickly escalated into something far more sinister as they preyed on him because of the color of his skin. But what those officers didn't realize was that Samuel wasn't just a humble farmer. As the truth about his family and their influence came to light, it wasn't just the officers who were left in shock. It set off a ripple effect that would change their town forever. Before we get into this gripping story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you're ready to be moved by Samuel's journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The morning sun cast long shadows across Samuel Johnson's farm as he worked methodically through his daily routine. At 78 years old, his movements were slower than they used to be, but his hands remained steady and strong from decades of working the land. The dawn light caught the silvery strands in his close-cropped hair as he bent to inspect a row of young corn shoots, his weathered fingers gently touching the tender leaves. "Looking good this year," he murmured to himself, satisfaction evident in his deep voice. The 20 acres he tended weren't vast by modern farming standards, but every inch was meticulously maintained. The neat rows of vegetables, the well-maintained fencing, and the freshly painted barns stood as a testament to Samuel's lifelong dedication. Rising carefully, he stretched his back and surveyed his property. The modest white farmhouse where he'd raised his family sat at the end of a dirt driveway, its wraparound porch swept clean despite the constant battle with Georgia red clay dust. This land had been in his family for 3 generations, purchased by his grandfather in the years following emancipation. Samuel felt that history in every step he took across the fields. As the morning progressed, Samuel climbed into his old pickup truck, heading into town for supplies. The vehicle, like everything else he owned, was well maintained despite its age. He pulled into Parker's General Store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," Tommy Parker called out from behind the counter. The young shopkeeper's face lit up with genuine warmth. "How are those tomatoes coming along?" "Morning, Tommy," Samuel replied, his usually serious expression softening. "They're coming along just fine. Should have the first batch ready for your mama's famous chow chow in about 2 weeks. She'll be mighty pleased to hear that. Nobody's tomatoes compare to yours, Mr. Johnson. It's like you've got magic in those hands." As Samuel gathered his supplies, other customers filtered in and out of the store. Some, like Mrs. Harrison, the retired schoolteacher, offered polite but distant nods, while others, like Bill Whitaker and his teenage son, deliberately avoided eye contact, shifting away when Samuel walked down the same aisle. The subtle dance of small-town racial dynamics played out in silent gestures and averted gazes. "Don't mind them, Mr. Johnson," Tommy said quietly as he rang up Samuel's purchases. "Some folks just can't seem to move with the times." Samuel's smile was gentle but tired. "Been that way all my life, son. Some things change slower than others." He counted out exact change from his worn leather wallet, the movement practiced and precise. Driving back home, Samuel's eyes briefly caught the photograph tucked into his dashboard. It showed a younger version of himself standing proudly next to his son Derek at his FBI Academy graduation. Now a high-ranking official in the bureau, Derek had come a long way from the curious boy who used to follow Samuel around the farm, asking endless questions about everything from soil pH to weather patterns. Samuel's chest swelled with pride at the thought of his son's achievements, though he rarely spoke of them to others. That wasn't his way. Besides, in his experience, drawing attention to success especially as a black man in a small southern town, often invited trouble. As if summoned by that very thought, red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. Samuel's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he carefully pulled over to the side of the empty country road. He'd been driving exactly the speed limit, as he always did, and his truck's registration and insurance were current. Two officers approached, one on each side of the vehicle. Their nameplates read Miller and Tucker. Officer Miller, a stocky man with close-cropped blonde hair, tapped on the driver's window with his flashlight. Despite the bright morning sun, Samuel lowered the window, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Good morning, officers. Is there a problem?" "License and registration," Miller demanded without preamble, his tone carrying an edge of contempt. As Samuel carefully reached for his documents, Officer Tucker spoke from the passenger side. "Your tail lights out." "With all due respect, officer, I checked all my lights just yesterday. They were working fine," Samuel replied calmly, though his heart was beginning to race. "You call my partner a liar?" Miller's voice turned dangerous. "No, sir. Just stating a fact." "Step out of the vehicle," Miller ordered. Samuel complied slowly, his joints protesting this sudden movement. The officers made him stand by the roadside while they performed an unnecessarily thorough inspection of his truck. Other vehicles passed by, slowing to stare at the scene, an elderly man being questioned by two officers. Samuel kept his face neutral, though shame burned in his chest. "Well, would you look at that?" Tucker announced after their inspection. "Tail lights working now. Must have been a loose connection. You're lucky this time," Miller added, handing back Samuel's documents with deliberate carelessness. "Better keep everything in proper order, Mr. Johnson. Never know when we might need to perform another inspection." The threat in those words was clear as crystal. Samuel waited until the patrol car pulled away before getting back into his truck. His hands were shaking slightly as he put the key in the ignition. The rest of the drive home passed in a blur. Samuel parked his truck in its usual spot and unloaded his supplies mechanically, his mind replaying the encounter. The weight of the officer's words pressed down on him like a physical burden. Instead of going inside, he walked out to his fields. The familiar smell of earth and growing things usually brought him peace, but today it provided little comfort. As he moved between the rows of plants, checking for insects and adjusting support stakes, his movements were automatic, his thoughts elsewhere. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but Samuel barely noticed. He worked steadily, losing himself in physical labor as he had done so many times before when troubled. But the unease remained, settling deep in his bones like an unwelcome guest. As the evening approached, Samuel finally stopped working and stood at the edge of his property. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful sight that usually filled him with satisfaction after a day's work. Today, however, he could only think about what tomorrow might bring. He glanced down at his soil-stained hands, hands that had worked this land for over 5 decades, hands that had raised a son to become a man of justice and integrity. These same hands now trembled slightly as he thought about the officer's veiled threats. A whippoorwill called from the woods behind his house, its mournful song echoing across the darkening fields. Samuel squared his shoulders and headed inside, determined to carry this burden alone. But as he cleaned up for the evening, the quiet of his empty house seemed to amplify his concerns. Before bed, he paused at the window, looking out over his darkened farm. The moon cast enough light to silhouette the barn and storage sheds, structures he'd built or maintained himself over the years. This land was more than just property. It was his heritage, his life's work, his legacy. The thought that it might now become a source of vulnerability weighed heavily on his heart. "Lord, Give me strength, he whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible even to himself. Then he turned away from the window, preparing himself for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, knowing that for now, his fears would have to remain unspoken. The patrol car sat idle behind May's Country Diner, its engine ticking as it cooled in the late morning heat. Inside, Officers Miller and Tucker lingered over their third cup of coffee, the remains of breakfast scattered across the dashboard. The air conditioning struggled against the gorgeous summer heat, and sweat beaded on Miller's forehead as he watched customers come and go from the diner's sun-bleached entrance. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Miller said, wiping his face with a paper napkin. "That old man Johnson's place. Did you see how well-maintained everything was? Man that age sitting on property like that. But he's got a nice little nest egg tucked away." Tucker shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. "Yeah, I noticed that too. All that equipment, those new storage sheds. He even got one of them fancy irrigation systems in his south field." He took a long sip of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter dregs. "People like him, they always keep cash around. Don't trust banks much." "Can't blame him," Miller chuckled darkly. "Banks weren't too friendly to their kind back in the day. But he's got money stashed all over that farm." The morning sun glinted off the diner windows, casting sharp reflections across their faces. "Remember that Vietnamese couple with the convenience store over in Bedford County?" he asked, a slow smile spreading across his face. "What was it we found wrong with their place?" "Health code violations, fire code," Miller corrected, grinning. "Amazing how many violations you can find when you know where to look. They paid up nice and quiet, didn't they? $5,000 to make it all go away, then another $3 the next month," Tucker added, until they finally sold the place and moved away. "Shame about that." Both officers laughed, the sound echoing in the confined space of their patrol car. Miller's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his wedding ring catching the sunlight. "Johnson's going to be even easier," he said confidently. "Man's all alone out there. No wife. She passed years ago. Son moved away to the big city. Nobody to make a fuss. Plus, who's he going to complain to?" Tucker snorted. "Sheriff Davis? Man spends more time on the golf course than in his office. Deputy Phillips? That boy's so green, he probably still sleeps with his teddy bear." "Perfect setup," Miller agreed. "And it's about time we did another property inspection, don't you think? Make sure everything's up to code." The patrol car's engine roared to life, and they pulled out onto the main road. The town's modest buildings gave way to rolling farmland, the morning sun painting everything in deceptively peaceful shades of gold and green. Samuel was on his knees in the vegetable garden when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He'd been carefully tending to his tomato plants, adjusting their supports and checking for signs of blight. The sound made him freeze, his hands buried in the warm earth. He knew even before he looked up who it would be. The patrol car's door creaked open, and Miller stepped out, adjusting his gun belt with practiced authority. Tucker followed, already pulling out a clipboard and pen. Samuel slowly stood, his knees protesting the movement. Soil fell from his calloused hands as he wiped them against his worn work pants. "Good morning, officers," he said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. "What brings you out here today?" "Routine property inspection, Mr. Johnson. We've had some complaints about local farms not meeting safety and zoning requirements." The word complaints hung in the air like summer humidity. Samuel felt sweat trickle down his back. Not just from the heat. Complaints. He frowned, glancing between the two officers. "I've been farming this land for over 50 years. Never had any complaints before." "Times change, don't they?" Miller said, his voice dripping with condescension. New regulations, new standards. Got to keep up with progress. For the next hour, Samuel followed the officers around his property, watching helplessly as they invented violations out of thin air. Miller paused by the fertilizer storage shed, clicking his tongue disapprovingly. "These chemical storage protocols are completely outdated," he declared, making notes on his clipboard. "But I don't use chemicals," Samuel protested. "Everything here is organic. Has been for 20 years now." Miller looked up, his eyes cold. "Is that what you're going to tell the EPA when they come out here? Argue with them like you're arguing with us?" Samuel fell silent, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. They moved on to the barn, where Tucker ran his hand along the ancient but sturdy wooden beams. "Fire suppression systems? Inadequate," he announced. "And these setbacks from the property line? Not up to code. Not even close." "Those property lines were established in 1920, Samuel said quietly. "They've never been an issue before." "Before being the operative word, Mr. Johnson," Miller said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Times change. Standards change. People need to change with them, don't they?" The morning had grown hot and sticky, but Samuel felt a deep chill in his bones. He watched as the officers continued their charade of inspection, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. Finally, Miller turned to face him, holding up his clipboard like a shield. "This is quite a list of violations, Mr. Johnson. Could mean serious trouble. Health department might have to get involved. Maybe even shut you down temporarily while you get up to code." The words hit Samuel like physical blows. "Shut down? But I'm in the middle of the growing season. My crops. Of course, there might be a way to handle this unofficially," Tucker interrupted, sharing a look with his partner. "Save everyone a lot of paperwork and trouble. $2,000 should cover the first round of improvements." The amount hung in the air between them. Samuel's mouth went dry as cotton. $2,000? That's cheaper than losing your farm, isn't it? Miller's voice had an edge sharp enough to cut. "We'd hate to see that happen, Mr. Johnson." Samuel's voice rose slightly. "You've taken almost everything I have. My savings, my equipment money. No more." Miller laughed, smashing another piece of equipment. "What are you going to do about it, old man? Call the police." Tucker joined in, kicking over carefully organized tool racks. "Maybe we should check that barn of yours. Probably full of safety violations. Might need to burn it down, start fresh. Touch that barn, and it'll be the last thing you do." The new voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Everyone turned to see Derek Johnson standing there, his FBI badge gleaming in the morning sun. He looked every inch the federal agent in his dark suit, his stance radiating authority. "Who the hell are you?" Miller demanded, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "FBI Assistant Director Derek Johnson." He moved to stand beside his father. "And you're both under arrest." Tucker forced a laugh. "For what?" "We're conducting a routine property inspection, right, Mr. Johnson?" He looked at Samuel with threatening eyes. "The only routine thing here is your pattern of extortion," Derek replied calmly. "We've been building a case against you for weeks. Every complaint, every suspicious deposit, every inspection. It's all documented." Miller's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain control. "You can't prove anything. It's our word against his." "Actually," Derek smiled coldly, "it's your word against about 20 victims we've interviewed, plus surveillance photos, financial records." He paused, and he glanced over his shoulder and the vehicles began pulling up to the farm. Federal agents had been watching this whole encounter. FBI agents emerged from the vehicles, weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one shouted. Miller and Tucker froze, their faces showing real fear for the first time as agents moved in to handcuff them. Neighbors began gathering at the edge of the property, drawn by the commotion. "You have the right to remain silent," Derek began, taking personal pleasure in reading them their rights. "Though I doubt that'll help you much. We've got enough evidence to put you away for a very long time." As the officers were led away, Samuel stood quietly watching, his expression unreadable. Derek turned to his father, concern etched on his face. "Dad, you okay?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to his damaged tractor, running his hand along its scarred surface. "Your mother always said I was too proud for my own good." He finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Said someday it would cost me." "Dad, this wasn't about pride," Derek insisted, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "You're trying to protect me, keep me from worrying. And look what it almost cost us." Samuel gestured to his vandalized equipment. "Everything we've built, everything we've worked for. But they didn't win," Derek insisted, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "You stood up to them. In the end, that took real courage." Samuel turned to face his son, tears in his eyes. "I should have told you sooner. Should have trusted you with this burden. We're family, Dad. Your burdens are my burdens, just like you carried mine all those years when I was growing up." Derek smiled softly. "Remember when I wanted to quit college my freshman year? You told me, 'Johnson men don't quit. They ask for help when they need it.'" Samuel looked surprised. "I remember everything you taught me, Dad, including the most important lesson. That true strength isn't about facing everything alone. It's about knowing when to stand together." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as FBI agents documented the damage and took statements from gathering neighbors. Tommy Parker had arrived and was talking animatedly with one of the agents, gesturing toward the farm. "Your mother would be proud of you," Samuel said finally. "Of the man you've become, the way you protect others. She'd be proud of both of us," Derek replied. "And Dad, I'm not just here to arrest those officers. I'm staying for a while to help you get the farm back in shape." Samuel started to protest, but Derek held up his hand. "No arguments. I've got vacation time saved up, and this place needs some work. Besides," he grinned, "I miss your cooking." As the morning progressed, more townspeople arrived, drawn by the news of the arrests. Many came forward to share their own stories of harassment and extortion by the two officers. "They threatened to shut down my hair salon last year," Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly black woman, shared with the FBI agents who had set up a temporary command post on Samuel's porch. "Said my ventilation system wasn't up to code. Took $3,000 to make it right." Similar stories poured in throughout the day. The Martinez family, who owned the Mexican restaurant in town, described months of harassment about their health permits. Mr. Chun, whose convenience store had been in the community for 2 decades, revealed how the officers had demanded protection money disguised as security consultation fees. Sarah Williams, a young reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, moved through the crowd, recording testimonies and taking photographs. "This isn't just a local story anymore," she told Derek, who was coordinating with FBI investigators. "What happened here speaks to a pattern of systemic abuse that's been ignored for far too long." The town's mayor, John Patterson, arrived around noon, his face ashen as he listened to story after story. He'd been in office for 6 years but claimed ignorance of the officers' activities. "With all due respect, Mayor," Tommy Parker spoke up, his usually cheerful face serious. "We tried to report this. How many complaints got lost in the system? How many times did people come to town hall only to be turned away? The mayor had no answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Local news vans began arriving by mid-afternoon. The story was spreading rapidly. FBI uncovers years of police corruption in small Georgia town. Sheriff Davis, who had spent more time on the golf course than in his office, submitted his resignation by email. 3 other officers who had known about Miller and Tucker's activities but remained silent were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Through it all, Samuel watched from his kitchen window, still processing the events of the past few weeks. The sight of his damaged farm equipment had been replaced by something remarkable. People working together to repair what had been broken. Bill Whitaker and his teenage son were fixing the tractor's gauge cluster, using parts donated by the local farm supply store. Mrs. Harrison organized a group of women to prepare lunch for the volunteers. Even Mr. Chin closing his store early to help repaint the barn door that Tucker had damaged. "It's something else, isn't it?" Derek said, joining his father at the window. All these people coming together, standing up for what's right. Samuel nodded, his eyes misty. "Your mother always said there was more good than bad in people. Just takes the right moment for it to show." Outside, the work continued throughout the afternoon. The Martinez family's oldest son, who had just graduated with a degree in agricultural engineering, helped restore the irrigation system. Tommy Parker arrived with a truck full of supplies from his store, still refusing payment. "The way I see it," Tommy explained when Samuel tried to protest, "this community owes you a debt, Mr. Johnson, not just for standing up to those officers, but for showing us what real strength looks like." As evening approached, Derek gathered everyone in the farmyard for an update on the investigation. "We've uncovered evidence of at least 50 instances of extortion," he announced. "Miller and Tucker are facing federal charges that will keep them behind bars for a long time. But more importantly, we're implementing changes to prevent this from happening again." He introduced Agent Maria Rodriguez, who would be overseeing the restructuring of the local police force. "We're establishing new oversight procedures," she explained. "Community review boards, mandatory body cameras, regular audits of all police interactions. This won't be a quick fix, but it's a start." The crowd nodded approvingly. For many, it was the first time they'd felt heard by law enforcement. Later that evening, after Derek had gone to bed, Samuel sat at his kitchen table with a pen and paper. He'd been meaning to write this letter for months. "Dear Grace, you always said I was too proud for my own good, and you were right. But our boy helped me learn the lesson you tried to teach me all those years. That true strength comes from standing together. You should see the farm now, sweetheart. Those jasmine vines you planted are still blooming, and they've spread all along the porch. But more importantly, you should see how the town has changed. People who never spoke to each other are working side by side in our fields. Children play together regardless of their color. It's becoming the kind of place we always dreamed it could be. Derek makes us proud every day. He's not just enforcing the law. He's making sure justice serves everyone equally. Remember how you used to say he had my stubbornness but your heart? You were right about that too. I miss you every day, but I feel your presence in every positive change that's happening here. Your spirit of kindness and acceptance is finally taking root in this community, and I know you'd be smiling to see it. Our grandson starts college next year. Can you believe it? He wants to study agricultural science. Says he wants to help modernize the family farm someday. The legacy you helped build will continue growing, just like those jasmine vines. With all my love, Samuel. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his Bible next to the pressed jasmine flower he'd saved from their wedding day. The next morning, as Samuel prepared for the day, the weight of fear and isolation that had burdened him for so long was gone. replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. As he walked his fields in the dawn light, he noticed Mrs. Harrison's car pulling up. The retired schoolteacher now ran a program bringing students to learn about organic farming practices on his land. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she called out cheerfully. "The fourth graders are coming today. They're so excited about harvesting those pumpkins they planted." Samuel smiled, remembering how this same woman had once crossed the street to avoid him. Now she was one of his most enthusiastic supporters. By mid-morning, the farm was alive with activity. Children's laughter mixed with the sounds of work and conversation. The Martinez family had set up their food truck near the barn, serving lunch to volunteers. The smell of fresh tortillas and Mrs. Chin's tea created an atmosphere of warmth and welcome. Tommy Parker, who had become something of an unofficial farm manager, was giving tours to visitors from neighboring counties who wanted to learn about their community's transformation. "It all started right here," Samuel overheard him saying. As the sun began to set, Samuel stood on his porch watching the last visitors leave. The fields stretched out before him, golden in the evening light. His father's old truck sat gleaming with new paint next to Derek's car. The barn door swung gently in the breeze, its fresh coat of red paint a bright contrast against the darkening sky. A whip-poor-will called from the woods, its song no longer seeming mournful but triumphant. The fireflies were beginning to emerge, their lights dancing across the fields like stars brought down to earth. Samuel thought about the letter in his Bible, about Grace's jasmine vines still blooming, about Derek moving closer to home, and about all the changes that had transformed his community. He thought about how fear and isolation had been replaced by strength and unity. "You were right, old girl," he whispered to the evening air, knowing somehow that Grace could hear him. "The darkness doesn't last forever. Sometimes it just takes a little courage to let the light in." And as night settled over the farm, Samuel Johnson stood tall, no longer alone but surrounded by the invisible threads of community, family, and hope that had finally woven themselves into something stronger than fear, more lasting than hatred, and more powerful than any darkness that might try to return. The farm would continue to grow, not just vegetables and fruits, but something far more precious. A legacy of justice, unity, and the courage to stand together against the shadows that threatened to divide them. And in that growth, Samuel had found not just peace but a new purpose, one that would continue to bear fruit for generations to come. Samuel's and Derek's story is a powerful reminder that real strength isn't just about standing tall when everyone is watching, but how you handle yourself when you're underestimated and alone. What would you have done in Samuel's shoes, facing such injustice? Have you ever been scammed by someone unjustly?